Tonight on ILTV Insider, could the next war in the Middle East start with a single bomb? As Iran races toward nuclear capability, U.S. President Donald Trump is vowing massive military strikes. And the question now is who will make the strike, the U.S. or Israel? Meanwhile, back home in Israel, the political world is reeling from Qatar Gate. Explosive allegations that Qatar money may have reached the heart of the Prime Minister's office. Joining me to unpack it all are Dan Perry, former Middle East editor and Europe-Africa editor of the Associated Press, and Felice Friedson, founder and editor of The Media Line. I'm Maayan Hoffman, executive editor of ILTV News. Let's get started. So I want to start with this question of Iran. Trump's rhetoric on Iran is really heating up from somebody who was speaking just not so long ago about the need for negotiations. He is now moving toward a strike. Khamenei has responded that if Trump's threats come to fruition, Khamenei will strike back. So it seems that we're starting to see a Middle East that might look like one we've never seen before, where Iran is actually very engaged in this battle, even more so than the two attacks in April and October. Do you think that we are actually going to carry out a strike? And if so, when we say we, is that Israel, the U.S., or both of us? Dan, you start.
Well, what's changed is that the U.S. is explicitly threatening attacks on Iran. Trump used the word bombing. Now, Trump does not engage in, consistency, so I can't predict what he's going to do. But it's clear that he has no patience for Iran's games on a negotiation front. He's offered negotiation, and Iran actually had the brazenness to say that they reject direct negotiation, but they're going to allow indirect negotiation. This is ridiculous nonsense. It is very good for the West to lay down the law with Iran, to not even enter negotiations that they would allow to have be prolonged the way that they were under Barack Obama, but basically to tell Iran it has to end its nuclear program or it will face consequences. I believe the talks should be about the terms of surrender. The world cannot tolerate an Islamic theocracy in Iran of a jihadist bent who has shown its inclination to sow instability and mayhem and violence all over the region, acquiring nuclear weapons. So it's very good that the Trump administration uses this moment when Iran is weak both internally and in the region, with its proxies, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, having been weakened, to try to impose terms. Basically, my favorite.
So please respond to that, because if that's the case, they're trying to push them toward terms, but in the end, Iran just might not agree. So do we strike? And if so, again, who?
I think that the United States at this moment is watching everything very closely. There's a lot going on that does not meet the eye. There are meetings that are happening right here in Israel and elsewhere at the moment that many are not aware of as well. It's very possible that we will see an attack on Iran. What the question, of course, is, will Iran be attacked by the United States solo? Is the United States going to involve Israel, as we just saw did happen quietly against the Houthis? The fact is that Iran has gained tremendous momentum in terms of its nuclear development. There's no bones about that. Everyone's been saying it. To what extent, it's not clear, but that is for certain. And you cannot, and I agree there with Dan, allow Iran to have that kind of capacity and hold that over the world. Bigger than that, of course, is the fact that as we are witnessing, and tie that into what's happening with Iran's control over the Houthis and strapping the Red Sea and having no shipping able to move. There's so many problems that right now directly impact not just the United States, but the globe. The United States will not go it alone. I think the question is, who's going to be involved? Who's going to be drawn in? How far is this going to spread? And the real issue to look at, too, is the United States bases. Because what was Khamenei's comment? He said that we will attack U.S. bases.
I think the U.S. can survive an attack on its bases. If Iran really wants a war, it will get a real war. That regime is weak. It is very unpopular. Probably some of the happiest people in the world about the saber rattling by Trump are the Iranian people who are waiting to be freed. The JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal that Trump walked away from in his first term, I was not a fan of walking away from that. Mm-hmm. But what was that really? That was a deal with the Iranian regime that we will not mess with you in exchange for you ending your nuclear program. It basically sold out the Iranian people. But the Israelis could live without a nuclear threat from Iran. When Trump walked away from that, he had no plan B for preventing Iran from then resuming its enrichment, which they did. I believe that was a terrible, horrible a mistake in judgment and certainly in execution. And much of the Israeli security establishment agreed with me. I would hope for better judgment now. I don't think you can really negotiate too much with this Iranian regime. Their activity in the region has been nothing short of an outrage. They oppress their own people, and they are a menace to the region and the world. I think there are real possibilities for setting back their nuclear program in such a way that it would also weaken their regime. But that would involve the most powerful bunker-busting bombs directed at Natanz and Fordo enrichment plants, and at the Iraq heavy water facility. That would be tremendously embarrassing for Iran. And the U.S. can do that, Israel much less so. There's no reason to involve Israel and confuse the narrative and create Muslim agitation against Israel. I think with the Houthis, Israel supplied intelligence. That maybe, but I would want Israel to stay away.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, let's say that Trump does carry through with these bunker busters and does do some real damage. Iran, in its embarrassment, is likely going to have some retaliation or counterattack. Does that then involve Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, etc., and is that targeted at Israel?
Hamas is not in no particular position to do significant damage to Israel today. Hezbollah has been thrashed in Lebanon. Lebanon does not want any further involvement as an ally of Iran, and they have right now some potential for actually taking control of their own country again. As for the Houthis, they are a ragtag militia. I'm not suggesting that they're easy to demolish because they don't care about damage to their own country. The Houthis have caused the deaths of about 400,000 people in Yemen, and they don't seem to care. So that is a legitimate problem. But do I think that the mightiest military on earth can't take care of them? I have to hope that, yes, it can. I don't think the Houthis can defeat the U.S. They can certainly impede maritime trade through the Red Sea and onward to the Suez Canal. That they have been allowed to do this more or less by the West and by the Biden administration in particular for a year or more has bewildered me. And again, I'm not a big fan of what Trump is doing domestically or with Ukraine or with Europe or in general. But with the Middle East, these are pretty good moves. The Houthis need to be schooled. The Iranians really need to be stopped in their march towards a nuclear weapon. And if at all possible, the Iranian people should be encouraged to find a way to overthrow them.
So I want to turn back to you, Felice, and actually piggyback on the Houthis here. How much of a regional threat do you think the Houthis really are? I mean, obviously, as Dan alluded, they've been impacting the maritime trade. That goes without question. But lately, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of rockets being targeted toward Israel, obviously intervened before they hit the country. But the sirens, the trauma, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv. I mean, do you see this as something that's going to grow before it gets less, even with U.S. action?
It's a good question, Maayan. Why don't we just look at it? If one rocket actually wasn't intercepted and there was a lot of collateral damage in Israel, what would happen? And that hasn't happened, but it can. And the fact is, and it remains, that the Houthis have developed their own drones. They are getting intel and information, not just intelligence, but training by the Iranians. Maybe they're giving them the money and the wherewithal, and I understand where Trump is trying to come in. The president is trying to say, I've got to stop the money, I've got to stop the funding, but they're giving them the know-how how to do this. The Houthis control Yemen, and that is the reality right now.
Half of Yemen.
But it doesn't seem like it's half of Yemen at the moment.
It's still big, even half is a big country.
But nobody can fight back. What is the first stop that President Trump is going to be doing in the Middle East now? It's Saudi Arabia. We need to understand what's going to happen in that visit. And believe me, it's connected to the Houthis as well.
Well, look, but the Saudis tried to fight the Houthis for 7 years with U.S. backing and with Egyptian backing and UAE active involvement, and they basically failed to dislodge them because they weren't prepared to do that much damage to the Yemeni people, and they weren't prepared to invade. So under that strategy, they failed to dislodge the Houthis from Sana'a and from the port of Hodeidah, which is the port they're using.
Though, at this stage? Do you think that the reality on the ground might look different? One of the
weaknesses, the weakness of the Iran nuclear deal was not, I believe, that Iran was not honoring it. The Mossad and the IAEA, the UN nuclear agency, says they were. The weakness was that it projected to Iran that it's okay for you not to just oppress your own people, but to spread mayhem through proxies around the Middle East. It wasn't a great deal, but it did stop the nukes. Now, that was the deal. I wouldn't reprise that exact deal. At this point, there is a risky idea on the table of actually attacking Iran, of tolerating their wrath and their retaliation. It won't be pleasant. Felice is right. A missile could get past the air defenses in Israel and cause tremendous damage. It could further harm maritime trade for however long it lasts. There could be attacks on U.S. bases. But there are times in history where you have to have a war. And I'm not suggesting we should rush into war with Iran. I'm not indifferent about the dangers of that happening. I do think if it did, it would be short-lived and should be short-lived. It should be decisive. But on the other hand, I am saying if they refuse a reasonable offer to talk terms of surrender, then it's something worth considering.
So I want to move to Qatargate, but I want you to respond real fast. What do you want?
The question really is are you really getting to all nuclear facilities? Maybe you're hitting one nuclear facility and it stops just part of the problem. And it is an issue. I mean, again, we're always looking at what does that mean, right? How much intel do we really have that we're being fed as the public, even as journalists?
That's where Israel comes in, by the way.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the question is, and Israel is
I think they're pretty well infiltrated. And if they really destroy the 3 facilities I mentioned,
3 major facilities,
and a few others, that sets them back by months, if not years. But there's the bigger issue, the message to Iran that your octopus of disruption with the nukes, with the proxies, with the oppression of your own people, with the terrorism around the world, all of that has to end. I'm not suggesting we should engineer regime change in Iran.
No, the people have to engineer that with our support.
Knowing quite a few people in the Iranian opposition and talking to them all the time, I have some confidence that if a true armed conflict emerged, and if Iran tried to retaliate, and to really engage in war with the West, and doubtless they'd also try to draw in Israel, which is why I say Israel should be careful and stay out of it as much as possible, then that war could be brutal and short-lived and inspire a revolution in Iran. I would expect.
But that was actually my next point, because really the people have been ready for this for years, and I've interviewed into Iran, and they are. There were points when sanctions were working, and really that would have helped to really ignite this. So maybe it's a decade later, and it might happen anyhow. The real issue.
You hear from so many people in Iran that they're happy about the sanctions because they're hoping the regime would be weakened. Now, the sanctions hurt the people. Right. Consider how hated a regime must be for that to be not a fringe voice, but what sounds like more or less a consensus.
And they are looking for this. This is the moment they were waiting for, or even people within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard willing and ready and able to do so. They always felt they were not getting the assistance they needed and that the world wasn't listening clearly. My bigger question here, too, is that if you see that there's an attack on the Iranian facilities in Iran, what happens that if you don't take out the Houthis' facilities at the same time, you have a big problem on your hands because they're still holding the Red Sea. And again, the Red Sea can't be left in the state that it's in. It really is a major problem in terms of shipping companies that have just stopped and ceased. And you can have somebody controlling the waterways that deal with Asia and Europe and getting oil and gas transferred.
I think what may be necessary is an invasion of the port of Hodeidah, which is the narrowest point of the entrance to the Red Sea. That's the port they use for this. But of course, Felice is right. They fire projectiles from further away, from mobile handheld launchers. They fire drones, not necessarily from the port itself. They're going to be difficult to deal with. I would imagine if the U.S. crosses the Rubicon and actually attacks Iran, they will have a plan for also attacking the civilian, the administrative infrastructure of the regime, and for silencing the Houthis.
100%. No, I want to stop you for a minute because I do want to move to another subject, which is Qatar Gate. Okay. And, we're talking all about what's going on in the region, but we do need to talk a little bit about what is going on here at home. And, Netanyahu last night called Qatar Gate a political witch hunt. That was his phraseology. He was claiming that this was all politically motivated. My question for you, Felice, is that correct? Is Netanyahu correct? Or is this an actual, serious national security investigation?
I'm not one that jumps to call something a witch hunt. I believe let the facts be seen, understand what really is happening. There's still so much coming out. Yes, the fact that Qatar is involved in funneling money, in getting their hands with soft power around the world is apparent to everybody. The question is, how was it used within the offices of power, and who was involved, and did Prime Minister Netanyahu know? Is it a witch hunt? I can't answer that. That's his terminology. I think that's his way of protecting himself. We really do need to wait and see what's going to happen.
Well, let me piggyback on that, because if it turns out, and we don't know the answers, as you said, but that Qatar is funneling money to Hamas in the past with Israel's permission, but supporting them, allowing them to live in the country. Hamas is hosting terrorist leaders in the country, and allegedly now paying the prime minister's office at the same time, meaning infiltrating into the highest realms of Israeli society or Israeli leadership. How is this not a full-blown security emergency? Shouldn't we be doing something about it right now?
Unfortunately, Maayan, this happens, I think, in every country. Qatar is in a very unique situation where people use them to be able to be the negotiator in certain capacities. The United States could use Qatar in negotiation with Iran, and they need them. So they have to find a way for checks and balances of how do I control Qatar in the United States in terms of infiltrating our institutions and where that money is going. And think about it in terms of Israel, it's not illegal for Israelis to do business with Qataris.
Correct.
I mean, I think that's a very important point.
It's a very good point.
There's a lot of hypocrisy about Qatar. Israel had diplomatic relations with Qatar until the Second Intifada. Qatar hosts one of the largest U.S. bases in the world and largest air base in the region, and very close to Iran. Qatar funneled money to Hamas at Israel's request because of Netanyahu's own foolish position that having Hamas be in charge in Gaza is somehow good for Israel because it divides the Palestinians and creates a conflict between the PA and Hamas. As Felice said, Qatar is weirdly useful because they straddle both sides of everything. Sure, they support the Muslim Brotherhood for that reason, they were at loggerheads with Egypt and Saudi and the UAE for a couple of years, but then they kissed and made up. Qatar apparently was paying someone, maybe two people, in the Prime Minister's office for something. We don't know if it was for intelligence, in which case we have an espionage scandal, or it was for lobbying and PR work from within the Prime Minister's office. This is a case where I tend to believe Netanyahu didn't know because there's so little in it for him, okay? The bigger issue in Israel, and forgive me for a little bit of a segue, is that when Netanyahu went to the police to testify about this yesterday, he comes out and immediately says in public that this is the witch hunt and that the police is being political. The police, which is run by a far-right winger, okay, Itamar Ben-Gvir. Netanyahu just last week, in trying to machinate the firing of the Shin Bet chief for political reasons, started to hint through various channels, including in public in his talk about the deep state, that the Shin Bet knew about October 7th.
Well, so this is actually a question.
I have to underscore, this is clear. He said the Shin Bet knew for hours about October 7th and didn't tell him. Now, this is being perceived in Bibi's base as a plot by the Shin Bet, allied with the leftist opposition, to let Hamas massacre Israelis. This has come from Netanyahu, that the police, the Shin Bet, the Attorney General, the judiciary, all of them are in a plot against him. This is insanity. You know, this is such a departure from good governments. You want your government to do good, or at least not do bad. This government is willing to burn down a house to achieve political points and to stay in power.
Respond.
I think what everyone is troubled about is that Prime Minister Netanyahu has not come forward, and even from the beginning, in taking responsibility. I think that is the issue. And forget everything else, I think it might have cleared a lot of air in the way everybody harbors so much hate. I think when you're going through the war you're going through,
sure.
I think when you're going through the fact that you have so many hostages still left, and by the way, Qatar does not need to stop this. They need to continue, because once the hostage deal is over, they're not needed. Well, let's not forget that either.
Well, I don't think Qatar is trying to prolong negotiations.
But Qatar enjoys that position. That's what they thrive for.
Can I just say, accepting responsibility is insufficient in Israel because they've developed this new paradigm where officials accept responsibility and that's it. And then they go on.
But eventually there'll have to be an investigation.
Listen,
we're going to have to understand who is responsible.
Netanyahu has done worse than not accept responsibility. He has done everything conceivably possible to deflect responsibility. They are now experimenting with a new narrative where, yeah, the government's to blame, but everyone's to blame, including previous governments. Well, guys, when everyone's to blame, then no one is to blame, okay? Netanyahu has prevented the establishment of an inquiry commission that has been de rigueur and even minor disasters by arguing that any inquiry commission, which would be run by a Supreme Court justice, as all of them have throughout the history of Israel, would necessarily be political and against him. So now he's delegitimizing the idea of inquiry commissions, which in Israel were categorically necessary to examine the lessons that are to be learned from a disaster. This is not a disaster. This is a cataclysm. Netanyahu is avoiding the inquiry into it plainly because he knows he will look bad and is hoping that memories will fade or bigger disasters perhaps will happen to take attention away from it. It's
Do you
a
agree?
disgrace.
I want to give Felice a chance to answer.
As bad as Israel's system is, it's still a system. There's still a court. There's still questions asked, and I feel everybody's jumping to conclusions. I say let's wait and see how this turns out. Let's see how the gag order is possibly lifted.
Oh, you mean at Qatar Gate?
And Qatargate, yes.
Yeah.
And I think you have to look at each case and be a little bit cautious and wait and not jump to the conclusion, which everyone is trying to do. Everyone's trying to get a got ya. This isn't about a got ya. This is about really understanding what happened on October 7th, really understanding what happened in terms of Qatar. What is Qatar's role truly? What does that mean for Israel, for the United States, for the world? Because they're a huge player. They're not going away.
No one can argue
I'm
that.
going to have to stop you.
But I'm just saying they're trying to avoid shedding any light on any of that. That's clear. And for that, I think they deserve condemnation.
So unfortunately, I really would like to keep the conversation going because clearly this is a topic that we could talk about for a very long time, but that is all the time that we have this evening. I want to thank you, Dan, and thank you, Felice, both for being here tonight. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at ILTV.tv. Thanks for watching Insider. Have a safe and pleasant evening.